Good morning. We're learning the laws of if you had to stop in the middle of your Shemona Esrei during your silent prayer, and the time that you waited was more than the time it takes to complete the Shemona Esrei. So let's say you usually daven Shemona Esrei, it takes you 8 minutes, and something happened, a circumstance beyond your control that you had to be silent for 8 minutes, then you have to go back to the beginning. So now we're learning the Mishnah Berurah and discussing what are those circumstances that are beyond your control, and is there a difference? And so let's get right to it. We're in the Mishnah Berurah. We're in Siman Kuf Daled Sif Katan Tes Zayin. That's 104:16. So Larosh, you have to go back to the beginning. Hine Lefima da'anu noagim ka'achras ha'Ramos. According to our practice, that we go like the Ramah Le'el v'Siman Samech Gabi Kriyashma Kedasa Poskim de'eno chozel Larosh ki'im beha shehia hayamachmas ones. Hu adin betfilanami hadin kain. So we paskin, when it comes to Shema, similar laws apply. They're not exactly the same, but similar laws apply. That the only time you go back to the beginning when you waited is if the reason you stopped was because it was due to circumstances beyond your control, which is called onus. It's not because you voluntarily stopped because you felt like it. Okay? So that's the law in Shema and the law in Shemona Esrei. Yesh omrim, the inyanenu da'irinin gabe akrav o shorsha b'kenagda o shepasik machmas listim b'kagavna mikra nami hefsik machmas ones the be'es hazeh lo hayachol ispal mikra ones v'chozel l'rosh ayedezeh. Some say that our case also is called onus when circumstances beyond your control that came from an outside source. For example, a scorpion comes to your leg, so you had to stop davening, or there was an animal headed towards you while you were davening, so you had to stop. Those are also called circumstances beyond your control. The Yeshomrim, others say, the Zelo Mikra Onus, this is not called onus. This is not called beyond your control for this purpose. Why? The only time that's called onus, beyond your control, is when the reason you can't pray is something intrinsic. It's intrinsic to you. Let's say you can't daven because, let's say you have to go to the bathroom very bad, and you had to stop your davening and take care of your needs. Or the place around you became unfit for prayer. Let's say somebody, there were feces somehow found their way, and there was a disgusting smell. So only in those situations is that considered beyond your control. Masha'en came ba'onus acher, but not so by another onus. So we have a difference of opinion. Some say if you stop davening because of an outside reason beyond your control, like a animal is coming, or you have a scorpion on you, you do not have to go back to the beginning, and some say you do. So how do we paskin? V'hechriya ha'Magen Avram, the Od Harbi Achronim, the Magen Avram, and many other rabbis conclude the betfila onus acher nami migre onus, that a case of onus, of beyond your control when it happens from an outside source, is called onus, and you do have to go back to the beginning. So if you stop davening because of any source, of any reason beyond your control, even if it's because there was a scorpion on you, there was an animal coming, if that happens, and you waited the time it takes to daven the whole Shemona Esrei, then you have to go back. And the reason that he holds like that by Shemona Esrei is because some say in Shemona Esrei, even if you voluntarily stopped, you would have to go back to the beginning, but we don't paskin like that. And he says, however, by Shema, the only time in Shema when you would have to go back to the beginning is if the onus was intrinsic. Not a case of circumstances beyond your control for coming from another source. So I know that was a little complicated, but just to summarize, for davening, if you wait the time that it takes to daven the whole Shemona Esrei, for example, 8 minutes, because of any source, any reason beyond your control, whether you had to go to the bathroom in the middle, whether the area around you became unclean, whether it was a scorpion on you, whether it was an animal coming, you had to move out of the way, you have to go back to the beginning. That's the halacha. Okay. Now, v'imlav, let's say you didn't wait a whole 8 minutes, but you had a shorter break for whatever reason. V'imlav, rotzalomer, shalosh shah b'shtika kadei gligmor kulo, of mikol makom shah harbe. You didn't wait the entire 8 minutes, the entire time it takes to say the Shemona Esrei, but you waited a good amount. Di lo shah raka de ligmor oso bracha, l'kul yama ina chozer raka oso makom belvad, v'ayim berlacha, mashkazam nishim derechayim. He says, for sure we're not talking about a case where you only waited a few seconds, because that's just davening. Sometimes you wait a few seconds to focus on what you're saying. It has to be that you waited for longer than the time it takes to say the entire blessing. So we're talking about when you waited for a good amount of time, but it wasn't the entire time it takes to daven Shemona Esrei. So what do you do in that scenario? Chozer letchilas. He says we go back to the beginning of that blessing. So if you're in the middle of V'li Yerushalayim Ircha and you stopped for a certain amount of time, not just a few seconds, but more a good amount of time, then you go back to the beginning of the bracha, and that's different than Shema. Shema, you do not. If you stopped when you're saying Shema or one of the blessings for that short period of time, then you would only go back to the place you stopped. But in Shemona Esrei, you go back to the beginning of the paragraph. So he says that the blessing, if you're in the middle of the blessing and you wait a long amount of time, then it messes up the blessing, so you have to go back to the beginning of the blessing. So that means if this wait period happened between blessings, so you didn't mess anything up, so therefore you don't have to go back and redo the blessing. So again, the case is, you're in the middle of a blessing, you waited a good amount of time, but not the amount of time it takes to finish Shemona Esrei, you have to go back to the beginning of the blessing. Habracha, okay. So let's say you didn't go back to the beginning of the blessing. What's the law? Chai Adam says if you didn't go back, he says you don't go back. You don't have to go back. So the Magen Giborim totally argues on the Shulchan Aruch. Beragra maskim l'shit as Rashba hamuv beis Yosef ayin sham de mashma mina de bechol gavna in a chayzer rak le'osa makom shepasak bilvad im lo sheshal ligmor kula machmas ones ta'az chayzer lo shetfila. I know I said a lot, but he brings this in actually another opinion here. We just said the Shulchan Aruch holds that you go back to the beginning of the blessing. The Vilna Gaon and the Magen Giborim hold that if you waited for a good amount of time, then you don't even have to go back to the beginning of the blessing. You just go back to the place where you stopped. But the opinion of the Shulchan Aruch is that if you waited in the middle of a blessing, you go back to the beginning of the blessing. Okay? So we're going to finish off with the topic of if you stopped in the first three blessings or the last three blessings, because we mentioned there that they're considered one unit. The first three blessings and the last three blessings of Shemona Esrei are like one unit. So what happens if you had a pause in one of them? The whole elu they're all considered like one blessing. So there you go back to the beginning of Shemona Esrei or the beginning of Ritzei. But according to the opinion that we had of the Vilna Gaon of the Magen Giborim, you just go back to the place that you stopped. Hifsik be'emtza bracha ein achozer elo letchilas oso habracha. Dechol be'emtza lo nikra chazara elo tikun alashon. So this law, the Chai Adam says, where you go back to the beginning of Shemona Esrei. Let's say, right, you waited and it was in the first three blessings of Shemona Esrei. So he said if it's in the first three blessings of Shemona Esrei, you have to go back to the beginning of Shemona Esrei. If you had this long pause. Now, the Chai Adam says that's only when the pause was in the middle of a blessing. But if it was at the end of one of the blessings, then you don't have to go back to the I'm sorry, I said it backwards. Sorry. You only have to go back if the pause was between blessing to blessing. But if the pause was within a blessing, then you just have to go back to the beginning of that blessing so you can repair the wording. The issue is that anytime you have a pause in the middle of a blessing, it kind of messes up the blessing. So you have to go back to the beginning of the blessing. So the Chai Adam writes, if it was let's say you had a pause in the middle of a blessing, even if it's the first three blessings of Shemona Esrei, you just go back to the beginning of that blessing. But if you had a long pause in the between, let's say blessing number 2 and blessing number 3, then you have to go back to the beginning of Shemona Esrei. Okay, so I know that was a lot, but just to summarize the main halachas, if you're davening Shemona Esrei, and for whatever reason you have to pause for the time it takes to daven the Shemona Esrei, the entire Shemona Esrei, let's say it's 8 minutes, and the reason you're stopping is because of circumstances beyond your control, you had to run to the bathroom, there was a car coming, you had to move, it took 8 minutes, so you have to go back and you have to start Shemona Esrei from the beginning. Now let's say you paused, but it wasn't 8 minutes, it wasn't the time it takes to daven Shemona Esrei. but it was a good amount of time. It wasn't just a few seconds. So if it happened in the middle of the blessing, according to the Shulchan Aruch, you have to go back to the beginning of the blessing, and according to the Vilna Gaon, you just can go. You can start from where you paused, where you stopped. And then we had one more halacha. If this happens in the first three blessings, the last three blessings of Shemona Esrei, if it was in the middle of the blessing, same law, you start at the beginning of the blessing. And if it was between, let's say, blessing number 1 or 2, or blessing number 2 and 3, then you go back to the beginning of Shemona Esrei. And I know that was a lot, but highly recommend reviewing it. And if you have any questions, as always, please feel free to contact me, and happy Election Day.